Rappahopa? The 3DS is no more. Well, I mean, we're pretty sure it's no more. See, Nintendo put out this statement that they didn't have any new 3DS games to announce, which is like, fine, maybe we'll get some later, right? But then, in the next part, they're like, maybe there'll be some third-party stuff, so watch out for that. And after reading that part, it's like, oh, I think I get what you're saying. You're saying there ain't gonna be any new 3DS games to announce. So, while it's true that some third-party offerings may trickle onto the little thing, as far as I'm concerned, the day a company stops supporting its own system with first-party software is the day that system is laid to rest. But instead of mourning the 3DS's death, let us celebrate its life. I've actually got a number of videos lined up to do just that. But first, let's talk a little bit about the system's life, its legacy, its eventual demise, and how many hours of my existence I've spent catching bugs in a game where cute little animals do nothing. Like none, am I right? Why would anyone waste their time doing that? It's impossible to talk about the 3DS without first making this one point clear. The 3DS was a fan-stinkin'-tastic little system. In fact, despite what many commenters claim, which we'll talk about in a bit, it's one of my all-time favorites. And that's saying something, because I was just the right age to be swept up by the Pokemon craze in the Game Boy Color era, and my love of games really took off around the time I got my Game Boy Advance, and the DS just plain wowed me with its touchscreen and 3D graphics. Even considering all that, even considering the 3DS came when my life started to get all busy and adulty, and I no longer had the time for video games that I used to, it still probably comes out on top in terms of pre-Switch handhelds. And I think this is for two main reasons. The first is, as I've talked about before, it was the first Nintendo handheld where 3D gaming was easy to achieve. The DS had some 3D games, like Super Mario 64, but they were few and far between. It took a lot of skill to make the most of the DS's hardware, so the vast majority of the library utilized 2D graphics with 3D assets used supplementally. Or if they did use 3D graphics, they were pretty simplistic and the scope was limited by a fixed camera. Also, not to mention, they usually looked pretty bad. I've always been of the opinion that Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks look terrible. I would have much preferred sprites. But the 3DS changed that. Suddenly developers weren't nearly as limited when it came to what they could design and achieve. It took some downscaling, especially in the resolution department, and the new 3DS would end up being required for a few titles, but the thing got ports of GameCube and Wii games. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask were only N64 games, but they looked loads better on the 3DS, and there was no doubt about it. Those were big, full 3D adventures. No fixed camera angles to hide stuff, no blocky little character models. They felt like full console experiences. And they were playable on that tiny little screen wherever you wanted. It was fully featured 3D gaming on a handheld. I know it's funny to speak so highly of the technical aspect now that the Switch makes the 3DS look like a kid's toy in comparison, but its power was a big deal when it came to the games that would eventually make it to the library. And even though the Vita blew it out of the water graphically, it was still fairly impressive at the time. More so when you consider the 3D effect, which again we'll talk about in a bit. The other reason the 3DS was so terrific? Well, the hardware gave developers the power to make great games, so that's exactly what they did. At the end of the day, a system's quality comes down to the games, and the 3DS just had so many great games. So many that there are still 3DS games in my backlog. A lot of them. I don't need to go into specifics here because, what do? Start naming them all? You know what they are. If you're watching this, I give it a 98% chance that you are sitting there nodding your head right now going, yep, and thinking about the giant stack of 3DS games you've got on your shelf. There's something for everyone in the 3DS's library, whether you like your Marios or your Zeldas or your JRPGs or your puzzle games or even just your Pokemans. There were some obvious slip-ups, which I don't see the need to go over here, but for the most part, Nintendo did a terrific job of representing all their major franchises on the system. Those might be the two main reasons the 3DS turned out awesome, but they certainly weren't the only ones. The extra hardware power also allowed the little thing to do a lot of stuff that, by that point, had become standard in hardware from other companies. Basically, the 3DS was finally able to store a significant amount of info on its hard drive or on an SD card and run apps. The OS was able to do more than just, boot games and run a clock like the DS. The DSi introduced the whole app/eShop downloady idea, but that came so late in the DS's life that I never felt compelled to pick one up, and in fact, I only knew one person who bought one. The 3DS, however, had that all built right in. The eShop having tons and tons and tons of smaller download games was a huge deal because it expanded the library immeasurably and allowed for smaller, cheaper experiences, which were absolutely perfect for handheld play. It was another one of those game changers because before that point, it pretty much didn't matter what it was. If you wanted a cute, casual little experience just to kill time with on your Game Boy or your GBA or your DS, you had to cough up 30 or 40 bucks for it. But the 3DS made that a thing of the past and delivered countless smaller indie games on top of its already vast catalog of retail games. And something that was a really big deal for me personally was the ability to download full retail games digitally. Between my retail games and my eShop games, I remember being so amazed. Just straight up amazed that I could be out of the house, whip out my 3DS, and switch back and forth between dozens of different games. I felt like I was living in some sort of crazy technological alien future with flying cars and stuff. What? I can just pick between 100 different games at a whim? That's amazing. It's crazy. It's not even possible. Then there was all the built-in software, which ties in nicely with talking about the system's other hardware features. Well, the thing had like 16 cameras on it, so Nintendo tried their hand at augmented reality. In the end, it didn't end up being a really big deal, just sort of a fun little diversion, but I will say, at least in the early days of owning my 3DS, I was pretty into it. Watching the AR cards come to life and moving them around was a trip! A much bigger deal, though, was Face Raiders. You guys ever play Face Raiders? The novelty didn't last too long, but while it did last, it was pretty darn hilarious trying to shoot my friends' disembodied heads while they flew around me making funny faces. It was that kind of Nintendo brand party kind of silliness that the company always seems to revel in. Much more engaging, though, was Street Pass, coupled with the Mii Plaza. I'm gonna go into all that a little bit more in a future video, but I will just say that the idea of passing people, then getting to meet their Miis and play games and swap puzzle pieces with them, it was awesome. Of all the features that didn't make it over to the Switch, Street Pass is the one that I missed the most. Nintendo loves creating all these funny little social experiences, and the Switch just isn't the same without it. One new thing with the 3DS that I'm glad has actually stuck around is the gyroscope. You've probably heard me talk about it a bunch before, but I'm a huge fan of gyro aiming. I guess I just really stink when aiming with a stick, so fine-tuning my aim by moving my system or controller is like 10 times more accurate for me. And I might not have played that many games that utilized it on the 3DS, but when I did, it made all the difference in the world. In fact, it's the only reason I played Resident Evil Revelations. It's one of my favorite 3DS games, and I just could not play it until I turned on gyro aiming. I just couldn't. Aiming with control sticks is hard enough for me, but that circle pad was absolutely impossible. So now we come back to 3D. I know that I'm in the minority here, but I loved the 3D effect on the 3DS. It just looked so cool. It added this awesome depth to whatever I was playing. It was like the games came to life when I pushed up that little slider. It was like a tiny little taste of VR. I would just sit there and marvel at it sometimes. And my gosh, did it ever help with depth perception and accuracy in things like Super Mario 3D Land. I remember switching from 3D Land over to 3D World, and suddenly I was missing all these easy jumps. Like my crutch had suddenly been taken away and I couldn't tell where my character was anymore. It's pretty funny though how unimportant the feature ultimately was. Most people just didn't care about it, and since it couldn't be implemented across every single game, Nintendo didn't want to force the feature like they halfway did in some parts of 3D Land. It's one of those things where you don't want to require it, but if you don't require it, then it's not going to get utilized very much. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's great that they didn't force it. It's just weird that they based so much of the thing's identity on something that was ultimately just an option, and one that they eventually did away with on the 2DS. Sometimes Nintendo just gets an idea in their head, and they had wanted to do a 3D console for so many years that they just kinda did it. And then it was done, and they moved on. It's pretty funny how often they do that. So I don't know if you young folks will remember this, but way back in the ancient year of 2011, the 3DS had a heck of a rocky start. The success of the Wii and the good early reception of the 3DS's concept made Nintendo cocky. They assumed they could get away with launching the thing at a steep $250 price with zero, count 'em, zero compelling launch games. No Mario, no Zelda, not even something like Wii Sports to really grab everyone's attention. Instead, we had Pilot Wings and Steel Diver Do you like mildly fun budget eShop titles priced at $40? Because that's all there was to play on day one. And like, I really can't stress enough how much doom and gloom was going on at the time. After launch, sales fell off a cliff, and it was a bad time for Nintendo. I think the only thing that helped was that they were still coming down from the Wii's crazy success. If the 3DS had launched the following year with the Wii U and both had struggled at the same time, I am pretty sure everyone would have been honestly thinking Nintendo was done for. Like, legit for good done for. And it's definitely saying something that I was a huge Nintendo fan, I was fascinated by the 3DS, and I had eagerly snatched up every Nintendo portable since the Game Boy Color, and I did not get a 3DS at launch. There was just no reason to. Way too expensive and nothing to play. Nintendo's made some mistakes over the years, but the 3DS's launch has got to be up near the top. It is hard for me to fathom what they could have been thinking. But as we've seen with several companies over the years, great success can do weird things to a company's head. They have a successful product and they just assume for some reason that everyone will buy the successor no matter what. Heck, they ended up doing the very same thing with the Wii U. They had to learn the same lesson twice. But anyway, of course, they ended up dropping the price a few months after launch, and it cannot be overstated how crazy a move this was. I believe the proper term is unprecedented. Never in a million years would I have thought they'd do something so drastic so quickly, but they did it. They bit the bullet and just did what they had to do. And once the system was $180 and it had a Mario game on it, sales took off and it went on to sell a ton of units. Funny what having a good price and, games will do for a system, huh? I won't bore you with the complete history of the 3DS, but of course Nintendo eventually gave us the 2DS, the new 3DS XL, and the new 2DS XL, making the DS family of systems the most confusing family of systems in the history of video games. Wait, the 3DS plays games in 3D, but it doesn't play DS games in 3D, even though it can play DS games in 2D, and even though the 2DS plays 3DS games in 2D. Yeah, I wouldn't have liked to work at a game store during that time. I never did end up upgrading my system, though I certainly came close. When Majora's Mask came out alongside the new 3DS XL, I was so tempted to just go for it. At first I thought the low-res image looked really horrible blown up to a bigger size like that, but the added power and more comfortable grip sounded pretty great. But alas, I never did it, for I am very cheap. Frugal. I am very frugal. I just couldn't justify the price when I already had a 3DS that worked perfectly well. Though I will say, Nintendo's timing was great. The new model was when most of my friends finally jumped on board, and I suspect it was that way with a great number of people. The success of the new 3DS is proof that a mid-generation Switch upgrade is absolutely inevitable. It is a perfect way to reignite sales. The 3DS did indeed sell very well for a number of years, but its decline and eventual retirement were also inevitable. And here's something funny. Ever since the Switch launched, I've been of the opinion that the 3DS should retire. And I can't even tell you how many comments I have gotten telling me to stop hating on the 3DS. Arlo, why do you hate the 3DS? Why do you want it to die? Why would Nintendo kill the 3DS when it's still selling? Like, me saying I thought it had reached a natural stopping point was the same thing as saying I hated the thing's guts, despite the fact that I publicly stated how much I loved the 3DS and its games. People also seem to think that by saying I think Nintendo should devote resources to the Switch instead, I was actually saying that I wanted to go into people's homes and rip the 3DSs out of their hands and go around to all the stores and take them all from the shelves and throw them into a volcano. Like seriously, there were so many over-the-top reactions whenever I even suggested that the 3DS should retire. I know I've talked about this before, but here's the SparkNotes version of my opinion on the end of the 3DS's life. Every system has to be laid to rest eventually. It's still selling isn't necessarily a good enough excuse by itself when you've got a replacement already on store shelves. Nintendo doesn't want to abandon that big install base also isn't a very good excuse, because by that logic, we should still be getting first-party games for the Wii or even the NES. Trying to re-establish your install base is always a risk, but it's necessary. There always needs to be a new system because that's how the industry moves forward. You need to innovate and utilize utilize better and better hardware in your game design. At least when you're a big hardware company like Nintendo. So while yes, the 3DS does have a big install base, it makes more sense for them to put all their eggs into the Switch basket, because the more they work at making it a great system, the more people will buy it. Splitting development was what hurt them in the past, so now more than ever, it is important for them to make sure they've got tons and tons of stuff for customers and potential customers to buy. You can't just hold on to your old success forever. You need a new success. And I know people have given me a hard time whenever I've said any of that, but it seems that Nintendo has kind of agreed with me. The last couple years of the 3DS's life were a little bare. There were some highlights in there, but for the most part, it was ports and remakes and simpler games that probably didn't take a ton of money to develop. And I think that was the perfect way for the 3DS to bow out of the race. They didn't have to give a lot of their resources to the thing, but they were still able to make a little extra money from that big install base. And really, even if you think Nintendo was wrong to slow things down, I say the proof is in the pudding. The last few major games to be released on the 3DS have seen pretty darn low sales. To be fair, was this maybe a self-fulfilling prophecy? Did the 3DS's games start selling badly because interest in the system was waning, or simply because Nintendo assumed interest would wane, so they released fewer major games? I guess we can't really know, and it might be a combination of the two, but I still think the timing was perfect. The 3DS had a good, long life, and it even got new games for 2 years after the release of its replacement. Even if the titles weren't super exciting most of the time, that's still pretty darn good. If you ask me, which you basically have by clicking on this video, I think this is a perfect time for the 3DS to finally hang up the gloves. But even if Nintendo's done making software for it and third parties will most likely soon follow suit, the 3DS will live in my heart forever. I'll always remember being blown away by the Super Mario 3D Land kiosk at Best Buy and deciding right then and there that I needed a 3DS for myself. I'll remember the absolute thrill I felt whenever I saw that green Street Pass notification light. I'll remember my fingers cramping horribly from playing Resident Evil in bed for too long and me not caring. I'll remember wanting to throw my system across the room after trying and failing 2 billion times to beat one of the Kong levels in Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D. I'll remember the countless hours I spent doing basically nothing in Animal Crossing. Man, Animal Crossing, it's amazing. I think you know what I want from you. It's several long, detailed stories about your experiences with the 3DS down in the comments. I want to know everything. Every little thing. Spare no detail, no matter how small. It might as well sum up your entire history with the thing. List your whole game library while you're at it. And I promise I will read every word. Every single word. Definitely not lying for comedic effect. Nope. Not at all.